Before the war, where were you living?
Before the war, I was living in Peckham, in London.
When did you know or find out when the war broke out?
I found out we were all listening to the radio, and it was the 3rd of September 1939, which was my birthday, and war was declared. It came over the radio.
What was your family's reactions to that declaration?
Well, as a 6-year-old, I wasn't too aware of how they felt, except that I knew they were concerned. And shortly after that, because of course we expected bombing straight away, we moved down to Southwick in Sussex, which was my father's sister's home, and we stayed there for only a short while until it was obvious that the bombing wasn't going to happen straight away, and that it seemed that the Air Force, the fighter pilots, were able to put things back in that regard.
When was the first time you saw enemy activity?
Well, I didn't see anything in London because we were evacuated pretty soon after then, after the beginning of the war. But I saw dogfights in Dartmouth, which is where we evacuated to, and German aircraft crashed, had been brought down in dogfights. And also I can recall a Spitfire being shot down by a German plane, and that fell into the sea just at the mouth of the river. And that was later found and brought up and is in the local Dartmouth Museum to this day, the engine of that aircraft.
What was the day like when you were being evacuated?
Oh, chaos. We went to schools, and my brother and I were fortunate in that my mother came with us as a helper. She was responsible for a crowd of kiddies. And yes, we all got on the train at Paddington, and it was so crowded we sat on our suitcases in the corridor. And away we went to we knew not where. And it was a long old journey.
What did you do to keep yourself amused?
Very little, because you hadn't got much space. Looked out of the window, I think, that I'd never been on a journey like that before.
Was any of the kids not aware of what was going on?
Well, we were all aware that we were going somewhere, but I don't think we knew why, except, of course, we all had gas masks.
What was it like when you got to your new family?
Oh, it was like stepping back in the world. Servants in the farmhouse, water from the well, oil lighting and candles.
Did you get up to any mischief in your new home or any surrounding areas?
Yeah, I got into trouble once because I cut the cat's whiskers. You know, I thought they need trimming, so I trimmed the poor old cat's whiskers, and I got told off because of that.
Did you ever experience a raid or have to be called into a shelter at any time?
Yes, when we got back, I stayed for about 2 years in Dartmouth, and then of course the tide of war had changed, and I came back home. My brother having come back the year before, because of being 2 years older, his education was the important thing. So I was in Dartmouth for a year by myself, and when we got back, I can recall being at school, and the doodlebugs were coming over, and they got us all into the shelter on that occasion. But fortunately it passed over before the engine cut out and it fell down and exploded.
How terrifying was the sound of the doodlebug?
Well, we didn't realise that we were likely to be blown up, so we weren't sort of frightened of it, but yeah, it was a weird old sound.
Going back to the evacuation in your new house, were you with any other kids that you didn't really know, or were you with friends?
We arrived at Dartmouth, having crossed the river on the ferry from the other side, because there's no train service there, although there's a station in Dartmouth, but no train ever goes there. And we arrived, and we were all heralded into a hall, and in this hall they had temporary beds set up, canvas things, you know, and because we'd had this journey, they made us all, the young ones, 6-year-olds, get into these beds, although we didn't feel like going to sleep at all. And then over in one corner there was a table with some females on it, and they were calling the kids from wherever and deciding where they would go, who they would stay with. And we, that's my brother and I, were indeed extremely fortunate to be chosen to go to this farm. And away we went and arrived at the farm and met the farmer, Mr. Earl and Mrs. Earl. And both their mothers were there. And we called them Brown Granny and Black Granny, because one wore a brown dress and the other wore a black dress. I can remember that quite vividly. Another thing that sticks in my mind is that hearing the people talk, because it was a totally different accent to what we were used to, and I can remember them saying something about the mango field. And my mind straight away thought, well, how can you have a field full of mangles, which is what my mother used to put the washing through? Silly things you remember, isn't it? Well, it was a wonderful time on the farm, really.
Spies in the house opposite?
Oh yes, we were extremely well fed, wonderfully looked after, and it was an outdoor life as well. And yes, there's one thing that sticks in my mind, and that is adjacent to the farm was a very luxurious bungalow, which belonged to an author whose name I can't remember at this moment, but I think he was a controversial author, and he was married to an Austrian, and the Austrian, his wife, what are my things I'm trying to say here? That's right, yeah. It was thought at some time that she was a spy, and that she was communicating somehow or other with submarines, because this part of the country faced the sea, and you could see the sea from the farm and this bungalow. And I can recall that there were several times when people arrived, men, sailors sometimes, officers, and that was something to do with keeping an eye on her. I don't know what happened to her in the end. Another thing, I was there on the farm when they had the exercise for the landing in Normandy on Slapton Sands, where a German torpedo boat, was it, or something, discovered the exercise and started banging away at the ships who weren't expecting it, and quite a lot of loss of life occurred on that occasion. And I was there at the time, didn't know what was going on, mind you, but I could think something was afoot because there was a lot of discussion going on between the people around. Another thing was, one of the men that used to come up there, that was to do with MI5 or something like that, was a fellow called Joe Braddon. And he, in later life, became a judge. He was very interested in dogs. And he turned out to be a judge at Crufts, which is interesting. My brother met him later in life. So I knew about that.
What about the Americans that were buried there, when it happened on the beach or something?
Yeah, we didn't know about that. It was all covered up. Oh. That came out later.
That tank that's still there, that man with the tank that stands there.
Oh yes, they got a tank out from the sea, which sank with the landing boats, and that's been erected at Torcross, which is the end of Slapton Sands.
How's life, well, adjusting to life after the war?
I don't know, you sort of adjusted to life. It was just, you carried on. I was fortunate in that until I was all 20, every year I'd go back to Dartmouth for a holiday on the farm. In fact, I very nearly went into farming instead of course of life that I finished up with. But because of a certain young lady who turned me on somewhat, I declined.
Years ago, 10 years ago.
Your times in shelters, did you experience any bombs falling or the sound of the planes droning over the top?
We lived in a place in Peckham. It was number 7 Morby Road. This must have been before we were evacuated. And the house had belonged to my father's mother. And before she let us go and live there, she had a lodger. And that lodger was called, his name was Tommy Farr, who was a boxer. I don't know whether you ever heard of him.
Famous boxer.
Very famous boxer. And that was before he became famous, of course. But he was the lodger there for a while, which I thought was rather interesting. We had a shelter in the garden, and we would try it out occasionally, not when bombing was going on, because, as I say, we really were evacuated before too much of that started, but we did try it out and slept in it.
Can I butt in?
Yeah.
We had a table shelter, and we all used to sleep in it at night. It was my mother, my sister, my grandmother and me. And of course we were living on the south coast, so we did hear them going over on the way to London. And the thing that I remember most was I was out in the street one day and these bombers came over, and I looked around and my brother was up the road behind me and he fell to the floor, and there was gunfire and I thought they'd got him, but it turned out he just heard them coming and got flat to the floor to save himself. But it was frightening at the time,
So what were your experiences?
Well, what we're saying about one of the things was we couldn't have any sweets, could we? We had ration books with little coupons in, and we had was it £1/4 of sweets a week?
Something like
that. About £1/4 of sweets. Can you imagine? £1/4. And no bananas. Only people with young children with green ration books could have bananas, and they used to come in about once a month. And all this went on after the war, didn't it, for a long time, ration books.
But we used to eat in community centres.
That's right.
Town halls.
The town hall, I used to go there for lunch. Because we didn't have at school, and my mother was at work, and my brother and sister were at work because they were older. So I used to go along to it used to be the Ronnock, didn't it? Then
that was one, and the
town hall. Yeah, and have a lunch.
Tell them about the Americans that were eating there.
Americans?
Yeah. Was it you or was it?
No, wasn't me.
Yeah, we were having our meal one day in the Hove Town Hall, and there was an American section, and we could see them all eating, and as they finished their meals, they got up and started to remove all the cutlery. And we thought they were stealing it. So we went and told somebody, and they said, oh, no, they bring their own equipment.
I remember when I first heard about the doodlebug, I was in a dancing festival at the Dome at Brighton, and we were standing on the stage at the end of the class to be adjudicated, and some important-looking gentleman came along and took over the microphone and told us that doodlebugs were approaching. And this is that we'd have to look forward to in the months to come. And they came over, and the siren used to go, didn't it, when they were coming? Mm. And then used to scarper to somewhere, to a shelter or somewhere. And before we had our indoor shelter, we used to get in the cupboard under the stairs when they were coming over, hoping we'd be safe there. Or some people used to have a basement, didn't they? Mm. Go in a basement.
I can recall back at Southwick, when I came back from Dartmouth. I suppose I'm talking about 1944ish, something like that. There was a raid at night, and in the morning, going to school, we used to go through the recreation ground where there were tennis courts, and you could see pieces of metal on the tennis courts. Whether they were pieces of shells going up or bombs coming down, we never knew. But there were the pieces.
What was it like when you found out the war had been won?
Oh, lovely.
Oh, yeah, we had big celebrations.
Parties, street parties.
Yes, I can remember my father put lights out the front.
Well, yes, because we'd had blackout all through the year. Every night you had to pull, your curtains have got black curtains, and if you didn't, the old warden knock on the door, didn't he?
That's right.
And we had Dad's Army. My brother belonged to Dad's Army, but in those days it was called the LDV, the Local Defence Volunteers, and they used to practice their drill in the park, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. And they weren't all old. I mean, my brother was about 17.
Were the real Dad's Army like the TV show is now?
Well, no, I think they were a bit more serious, weren't they? You know.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they were all different ages. Old men that were too old to go, and young, like my brother, who was too young to go. So they were sort of various ages, weren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Were there many street parties and events?
Oh yes, every street
yeah.
had a party.
Yeah.
Oh, it was lovely, wasn't it? And then all the men started coming back from the war, but during the war we had quite a lot of Americans over, didn't we?
Yeah, yeah.
American soldiers used to turn up, and the girls used to love that. I mean, I was too young. I was only 12. But the older girls were,
Yeah, I bet they were.
What activities did you get up to during the war?
Well, I was at school. Because I was 8 when it started, and then when I was 11, I went to the grammar school. So my education carried on, didn't it? If there was an air raid right out to the park, we had shelters out in the grounds. So we did what things we usually do: play tennis, whatever you do at school, netball. Life just went on, didn't it?
Would you say that your education suffered because of the war?
No, not really.
Well, mine certainly did.
Did it? No.
Because once we got down to Dartmouth, we didn't go to school for weeks and weeks.
No.
And it was a funny old school when we eventually did go.
Yeah. No, mine. Because I passed the 11 plus while the war was on, and then went straight to grammar school, and it was just normal. Just as I say, if the siren went, we all went out and sat in the shelter.
You know how far the farm was from Dartmouth itself, don't you?
Yeah.
I used to walk that. I mean, it's 6, 7?
Yeah.
And I used to walk that every day, there and back again.
How many
to
miles?
school. Oh, must be 2 or 3 at least.
Yeah.
And now, everyone goes to school by car.
Well, I used to ride my bike.
Yeah.
But, and I carried on with my dancing. Yeah, everything seemed to be as far as possible. We did, And my brother was too young to go to war. So he went afterwards, after it was all over, because he was too young. And my sister, she had to work, have to do a sort of wartime job. So they put on a railway halt, Fisher's Gate Halt it was called, her and another woman, because all the men had gone off to war. And they were there sort of late at night, weren't they? It's only a very creepy place too, wasn't it? Do you remember? Oh. So that was their war. Instead of going into the land army or something, that was her wartime job.
I mentioned my father's mother,
Yeah.
who lived number 7 Morby Road.
Yeah.
Well, she had who I imagined she'd married, but whether she had or not, I don't know. This fellow who was the black sheep brother of Sir Archibald Mackingdew.
Oh, the plastic man.
Yeah, that's the fellow that did all the
soldiers.
facial repairs from burnt airmen and all the rest of it.
Were you evacuated?
No, my mum wouldn't let me go. I'd like to have gone.
What were the reasons of not being evacuated?
Well, she was a widow, and my brother and sister were 8 years older and out to work, and she liked me to cling to me. You know what I mean? We went everywhere together.
It wasn't as if you were in London. I mean, we were
in Portslade, which is on the south coast. So.
Was there much enemy activity?
Well, only, as I say, going over. We used to hear them going over on their way to London. And we had sirens and all clear, so, you know, as I say, we used to, before we had the shelter, we got under the cupboard, you know, under the stairs. But every night, once we got the shelter, we slept in it. It took up the whole space of the living room. Great big square thing, you know. Mm. We used to crawl in it at night.
We had one as well. I was always bruising my knees on it.
And my old
gran,
she snored all night and nearly drove me mad. Yeah, but we got through it, didn't we?